The moment my daughter-in-law looked at me that night, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't irritation. It wasn't even contempt. It was certainty. The kind that only comes when someone believes you can no longer hurt them. We were seated around the dining table like any other evening. Plates, warm glasses half full, the soft hum of the television bleeding in from the living room. I had cooked dinner myself as I usually did. Out of habit, out of peace, out of the quiet belief that staying useful would keep me welcome. Then she set her fork down, leaned back in her chair, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're only fit to be a servant," she sneered. "You're useless to this family." The words landed cleanly, deliberately, like a blade meant to cut deep and stay there. My son froze. My grandchildren went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. She waited, watching me, expecting what I had always given her: silence. Instead, I placed my glass on the table with slow care. I met her eyes and said calmly, "Then why is this so-called servant the one paying all your bills?" The room went dead. Not quiet, frozen. In that moment, her face changed. Confidence cracked, fear flickered, and though she didn't know it yet, everything she believed about me began to collapse. Less than 24 hours later, she would be begging, and she would finally understand who she had underestimated. I am Elias Ward. I was 70 years old that night. A widower, a grandfather, and according to the people living under my roof, a man who had outlived his usefulness. After my wife died, the house felt too large for one person, too quiet. When my son suggested he and his family move in for a while, I agreed without hesitation. I told myself it was about family, about not eating dinner alone, about hearing children's footsteps in the hallway again. What I didn't admit was that I was afraid of becoming invisible. At first, things were polite, grateful even. Then polite became expected. Expected became assumed, and assumed became enforced. I cooked most nights. I handled the errands. I picked up the children from school when schedules ran long. I fixed things that broke. I stayed out of arguments. I let comments slide. I told myself this was the cost of peace. My daughter-in-law learned quickly what worked. She learned that I didn't like conflict, that I preferred calm over confrontation, that if she spoke sharply enough, I would step back. So she sharpened her tone, slowly, carefully, until it cut. That night at dinner wasn't the first insult. It was simply the first one delivered with an audience. My son stared at his plate like it had suddenly become fascinating. He did not defend me. He did not tell her to stop. He did not even look at me. I had raised him to be kind, thoughtful, steady. Somewhere along the way, kindness had been replaced with avoidance. The children noticed everything. They always do. My granddaughter sat stiff in her chair, eyes wide, unsure whether to look at me or her mother. My grandson stopped eating altogether. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. They understood that something had gone wrong. When I spoke back, it wasn't anger that guided me. It was clarity. I saw then how they saw me, not as the man who built the life they lived in, not as the person whose name was still on every document that mattered, but as furniture, useful when needed, ignored otherwise. Dinner ended awkwardly. Plates were cleared without comment. No one apologized. No one addressed what had been said. That too was familiar. In this house, discomfort was buried quickly like a body no one wanted to acknowledge. Later that evening, I stood alone in the kitchen, rinsing dishes that no one had thanked me for cooking. I watched my daughter-in-law move through the living room, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and sharp. When she noticed me, she turned away. It was the first time I saw tension in her posture. I went to bed that night without turning on the lamp. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a house that no longer felt like mine. Doors closing, footsteps pacing, the muffled rise and fall of voices that stopped whenever I shifted. For the first time since my wife's funeral, I didn't feel lonely. I felt alert. The next morning, the house moved around me as if nothing had happened. Breakfast dishes clinked, schedules were discussed. My daughter-in-law spoke to me with exaggerated politeness, the kind that feels rehearsed. "Could you take the kids later?" she asked, as if we hadn't crossed a line the night before. I nodded. Habit is a powerful thing. As I poured coffee, I noticed she checked her phone twice in under a minute. I noticed how quickly she glanced at me when notifications lit the screen. I noticed how her confidence had shifted into something tighter, more urgent. People don't humiliate you publicly unless they believe you are powerless. And people don't grow nervous unless that belief is threatened. I moved through the day quietly. I did everything I was expected to do. I said nothing about the insult. I gave no indication that anything had changed. Inside, though, something had clicked into place. I realized that I had been given a role. Not recently, not accidentally. Slowly, over time, reduced inch by inch until I barely recognized myself. And worse, I had accepted it. The afternoon passed without incident, but the atmosphere remained strained. Conversations were shorter. Laughter sounded forced. I caught fragments of whispered discussions I wasn't meant to hear, words like timing, and soon floated through the hallway before dissolving into silence. That evening, I watched my grandchildren do their homework at the table. My granddaughter glanced up at me, hesitated, then said quietly, "Grandpa, are you mad?" I told her no, and it was true. I wasn't mad. I was done misunderstanding my place. When everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The lights were low, the house finally still. I thought about the man my daughter-in-law believed me to be, an old widower clinging to relevance, a checkbook with a pulse, a servant who should know his place. She was wrong. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that silence is not the same as surrender, that stepping back is not the same as giving up, and that some men don't show their strength until they're forced to. Dinner had been her declaration. The next move would be mine. The house woke up the next morning, pretending nothing had happened. Sunlight crept through the curtains, landing softly on the same dining table where I had been reduced to a servant the night before. The coffee maker hummed. A cabinet door closed too hard, then reopened more gently, as if someone had remembered themselves mid-motion. No one mentioned dinner. No one apologized. In this house, discomfort was treated like a spill. Wipe it up quickly and move on. That silence wasn't new. It was the system. I moved through my routine the way I always did. I brewed the coffee. I set out bowls for cereal. I packed the children's lunches while my daughter-in-law scrolled on her phone, issuing requests disguised as afterthoughts. "Could you drop them off today? If you're going out anyway, we're low on milk." Always phrased as favors. Always assumed I would comply. I did. After my wife died, staying busy had felt like survival. The house had echoed with her absence, and filling that space with tasks gave me something solid to hold on to. Cooking, cleaning, fixing small things that broke, driving children to school. It gave my days shape. It gave me a role. What I didn't realize was how quickly usefulness turns into expectation. By mid-morning, the house felt like it was moving around me instead of with me. Conversations happened in corners. Doors closed softly but firmly. When I entered a room, voices shifted, then resumed once I left. It was subtle, practiced. I had the strange sensation of being both everywhere and nowhere at once. I took the trash out and noticed the mail was gone from the counter. Usually it sat there until I sorted it. That had been the unspoken arrangement for years. I glanced toward my daughter-in-law, who was standing by the window, phone in hand. She met my eyes briefly, then looked away. A small thing. But small things accumulate. The afternoon unfolded in fragments of quiet disrespect. A reminder that sounded more like an order. A comment about how long something was taking. A sigh when I didn't move fast enough. Each moment was easy to excuse on its own. Together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I picked the children up from school later that day. In the car, they were quieter than usual. My grandson stared out the window, kicking at the floor mat with the toe of his shoe. My granddaughter sat stiffly, backpack clutched in her lap. When we stopped at a red light, she looked up at me. "Grandpa," she said, hesitant, "are you going to be in trouble?" The question hit harder than any insult. "Why would I be in trouble?" I asked gently. She shrugged, eyes dropping again. "Mom was mad last night. Mad. Not wrong. Not cruel. Just mad. Children learn quickly which emotions are acceptable to name. At home, they disappeared into their rooms while I started dinner. I cooked out of habit, not obligation. I chopped vegetables slowly, listening to the sound of footsteps overhead. My daughter-in-law passed through the kitchen without speaking, phone pressed to her ear, voice low. I caught only fragments. "No, not yet. Just waiting. Before he notices." She glanced at me mid-sentence, then turned away, lowering her voice further. I stood still, knife paused over the cutting board. The words lingered sharp and unfinished. Before he notices. Notices what dinner that night was quieter than usual. No insults, no apologies. Just a careful distance, like we were all circling something we didn't want to name. My daughter-in-law watched me more than she spoke, her eyes flicking toward me whenever she thought I wasn't looking. The confidence from the night before was still there, but it had tightened, curled inward. Afterward, as I wiped down the table, my son hovered in the doorway. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. "You okay, Dad?" he asked finally. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked tired, older than he should have. His shoulders were tense, his eyes restless. "I'm fine," I said. It was the answer he wanted, the one that let him walk away without choosing sides. That night, I sat alone in the living room while the rest of the house slept. The television was off. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I thought about the role I had been assigned here, the one I had slipped into without protest. The helper, the babysitter, the buffer, the servant. No one had forced me into it. I had accepted it quietly, believing that being needed was the same as being valued. I had confused peace with dignity, comfort with respect. I realized then that the dinner insult hadn't come from nowhere. It had been rehearsed, tested in smaller ways over months, maybe years. She had learned how far she could push me by watching how far I would step back. And my silence had taught her everything she needed to know. The next morning, I woke early again. The house was still asleep. I poured myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the surface where my hands had rested so many times before. I noticed a faint ring where a glass had been set down the night of the insult, a mark left behind by pressure and time. I finished my coffee and stood to rinse the mug. As I turned toward the sink, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice drift down the stairs. "Make sure it's done soon," she said into her phone. "We don't have much time." I froze. There was no mistaking the edge in her voice now. No performance, no casual dominance. Just urgency. Control under strain, she appeared at the bottom of the stairs. A moment later, startled to see me standing there. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Calculation, maybe fear. Then it vanished, replaced by a tight smile. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. She lingered as if expecting something. A reaction, a question. When none came, she turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply against the floor. I stood there long after she left, the coffee mug still in my hand. The words replayed in my mind, fitting themselves into the fragments I had already collected. "Before he notices. Make sure it's done soon. We don't have much time." Whatever was happening in this house, it wasn't about hurt feelings or family tension. It was about preparation, about timing, about assuming I wouldn't look too closely. That assumption was their mistake. For the first time in a long while, I stopped asking myself how to keep the peace. I started asking a different question. Why did they believe I was already powerless, and what exactly were they trying to finish before I noticed? People mistake quiet for weakness all the time. They hear fewer words and assume there is less thought behind them. They see restraint and call it surrender. I had learned long ago that letting others underestimate you was often safer than correcting them. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the small desk in the corner of my bedroom with the lamp turned low. The house was dark, but not asleep. Pipes creaked. A door closed somewhere down the hall. A phone vibrated briefly, then stopped. Even without seeing them, I could feel the tension moving through the walls. My daughter-in-law believed she understood me completely. To her, I was a tired old man, clinging to relevance, grateful for a room in a house that no longer felt like his own. A widower filling his days with chores so he wouldn't have to sit alone with his grief. She thought my silence came from dependence, that my patience came from fear. She was wrong on every count. I had stepped back, yes. But stepping back is not the same as stepping aside. For most of my life, I had been the one who planned. Not loudly, not impulsively. I built things that had to last, projects where mistakes didn't just cost money, they cost lives. You learn in that kind of work to think several steps ahead, to account for human error, to prepare for failure long before it announces itself. When my wife was alive, she used to say I was incapable of relaxing. I always had a folder, always had a contingency. I smiled when she said it because it was mostly true. Responsibility does that to you. It rewires the way you see the world. After she died, I made a conscious decision to loosen my grip. I was tired of holding everything together, tired of being the one everyone leaned on without ever asking if I was still standing. So when my son and his family moved in, I let them take the lead on small things, then bigger ones. I told myself it was trust. I told myself it was love. What I never did was hand over everything. There is a difference between visibility and control. I had surrendered the first. I had never surrendered the second. That distinction mattered now more than ever. The following morning, while the rest of the house was still asleep, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a slim folder. Nothing dramatic, no bold labels, just plain manila worn soft at the edges from time. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't looked at in months, maybe years. I didn't open them yet. I didn't need to. Just holding the folder grounded me like pressing your feet into the earth when the ground starts to feel unsteady. Later that day, as I moved through the house, I began to notice details I might have overlooked before. A file drawer in the hallway cabinet left slightly ajar. A stack of papers on the kitchen counter that disappeared when I stepped outside. A notification on my phone about an account login attempt that I hadn't initiated. Each thing on its own could be explained away. An accident, a mistake, a glitch. Together they formed a shape. I stood in the hallway that afternoon, staring at the open drawer. My daughter-in-law was upstairs. I could hear her voice through the ceiling's sharp and clipped pacing as she spoke into her phone. I reached out and slid the drawer closed. Inside, everything looked almost right. Almost. But one folder had been shifted slightly forward, as if someone had removed it and put it back in a hurry. I didn't touch it. I didn't open it. I simply noted its position and walked away. That was the moment something hardened inside me. Disrespect is one thing. I had endured plenty of that. But interference, quiet, deliberate interference, was another matter entirely. That crossed a line they didn't realize existed. I spent the rest of the day behaving exactly as expected. I picked up the children. I cooked dinner. I smiled when spoken to. I did not ask questions. I did not confront anyone. Confrontation, I knew, would only teach them what I was looking for. It would warn them to hide better. Instead, I watched. That evening, my daughter-in-law sat across from me at the table, posture stiff, movements precise. She spoke about schedules, about errands, about plans for the weekend. Not once did she mention the night she had called me a servant. Not once did she apologize. Her confidence had returned, but it was strained now like a rope pulled too tight. My son avoided my eyes again. When our gazes met briefly, he looked away first. After dinner, as I wiped the table, I heard them talking in the living room. Their voices were low, urgent. I caught only pieces. Can't wait much longer. Everything's in motion. He hasn't noticed. There it was again. The assumption. Spoken aloud now, careless with repetition. He hasn't noticed. I went to bed early that night, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, listening, my mind replaying the past few days with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. The insult, the urgency, the paperwork, the glances, the silence. They believed the board was theirs. What they didn't know was that I had never stopped seeing the whole picture. I had simply chosen not to comment on it. In the early hours of the morning, when the house was finally still, I got up and returned to the desk. I opened the folder at last, scanning the first page slowly, carefully. My hands were steady, my breathing even. This wasn't anger guiding me now. It was confirmation. I wasn't being paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. Something was unfolding, and it was unfolding quickly. And whatever they were preparing, they were counting on my continued passivity to make it work. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, locking it this time. The click sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. Final. Intentional. I understood then that the next phase required patience. You don't interrupt a plan mid-construction if you want to understand it. You let it progress. You let people reveal how far they're willing to go. The most dangerous mistakes are made by people who believe they already control the outcome. As I lay back down the ceiling above me, dark and familiar, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not anger, readiness. They thought I was unaware. They thought I was behind. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. Something in the house had changed, and it wasn't loud enough to name it first. It was the kind of shift you feel before you see it, like pressure in your ears before a storm breaks. The mornings became tighter, shorter greetings, sharper movements. The house still functioned, but with a new urgency that hummed beneath everything else. People walked faster. Doors closed more deliberately. Conversations ended the moment I entered a room, then resumed later with the careful politeness of people who believed they were being discreet. I had lived long enough to know that when control is about to change hands, it rarely announces itself. It moves quietly through systems, habits, and assumptions. I noticed the mail first. For years it had been left in a neat stack on the entry table for me to sort. Bills, statements, the occasional letter from an old colleague. One afternoon I came home from the grocery store and the table was empty. The mail was gone. I asked no one about it. The next day, the shared calendar on the refrigerator had new entries. Appointments I didn't recognize. Times blocked off without explanation. When I asked casually what they were for, my daughter-in-law waved a hand dismissively and said, "Just things we need to take care of. Nothing for you to worry about. Nothing for you to worry about." The phrase lingered longer than she intended. Her behavior had changed too. The ease she once carried herself with was gone. In its place was something sharper, more focused. She spoke less, but when she did, it was with authority rather than attitude. Instructions instead of suggestions. Decisions instead of discussions. She no longer tested boundaries. She moved as if they had already been removed. My son, meanwhile, grew quieter. He spent more time in his office with the door closed, emerging only when necessary. When he spoke to me, his voice carried a strange formality, as if he were choosing words carefully, avoiding something or someone. Silence, I realized, can be cooperation when it comes too easily. One evening, as I carried a basket of laundry down the hall, I noticed a business card lying on the counter near the phone. I picked it up, turned it over once, then set it back where I'd found it. The name meant nothing to me. Neither did the firm. But the fact that it was there at all mattered. Later that night, I saw a car I didn't recognize parked down the street. It idled for a few minutes, then pulled away. The next day, it was there again, gone before I could get a clear look. It could have been nothing. It could have been anyone. But it had appeared at exactly the same time everything else had begun to shift. Timing is rarely coincidence. Over the next few days, I began to hear the same word repeated again and again, always in passing. Timing. Once, as my daughter-in-law stood at the bottom of the stairs, phone pressed to her ear. Another time when my son whispered something to her in the kitchen, his voice low and urgent, always paired with phrases like, before the end of the month, or as soon as it's approved. Approval, paperwork, processing. These weren't the words of domestic planning. They belonged to a different world entirely. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't let my questions show on my face. Instead, I listened. I watched. I let patterns form. It became clear to me that whatever was happening wasn't emotional. It wasn't driven by resentment or impulse. It was structured, planned, moving along a timeline that had been set without my knowledge. That realization chilled me more than any insult ever could. One afternoon, while the house was empty, I stood in the living room and looked around with new eyes. The furniture, the walls, the windows that caught the afternoon light just right. I had chosen this house with my wife decades ago. We had signed the papers together. We had imagined grandchildren running through these rooms. Now I wondered how easily people forgot whose life they were living in. That evening, my daughter-in-law spoke to me directly for the first time in days. Not unkindly, not respectfully, carefully. "You've seemed tired lately," she said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "Are you feeling all right?" The concern was rehearsed. Her eyes stayed on my face a fraction too long, searching for something. "I feel fine," I replied. She nodded slowly, as if filing the answer away. "Good. We just want to make sure everything's taken care of." Taken care of. After she left, I stood at the sink staring at my reflection in the darkened window. I looked the same as I always had. Older, yes, thinner, but not lost, not confused, not incapable. And yet I began to understand what they were building toward. The quiet changes, the paperwork, the outside presence, the emphasis on timing. All of it pointed in one direction, toward authority, toward control, toward a future in which decisions were made for me rather than by me. It wasn't about money alone. It was about who held the pen when it came time to sign. That night, as the house settled into sleep, I sat at my desk again, hands folded, breathing slow. I didn't open any folders. I didn't make any calls. I simply thought. The most dangerous takeovers are polite. They wear the face of concern. They speak in terms of protection and responsibility. They arrive not with force, but with forms. By the time someone asks for permission, the decision has already been made. I knew then that suspicion wasn't enough. Feeling something was wrong wouldn't protect me. Whatever they were preparing would move through systems that didn't care about feelings. It would require verification, documentation, proof. If this was a coup, it wouldn't be fought in the living room. It would be fought on paper. The next step wasn't confrontation. It was confirmation. As I turned off the lamp and lay back in bed, I felt the weight of the house around me, familiar and suddenly fragile. They believed they were being careful. They believed they were ahead. They had no idea how visible quiet plans become to someone who has spent a lifetime reading structures before they fail. The decision to act didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with calm. I woke before dawn the next morning and lay still, listening to the house breathe. Pipes clicked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked as someone shifted in their sleep. Everything felt ordinary and that was exactly why it mattered. Whatever was being done to me was meant to slip through ordinary moments unnoticed. I sat up, swung my feet to the floor, and accepted a simple truth. Watching was no longer enough. Silence at this point was no longer protection. It was permission. I dressed quietly and went to the kitchen, pouring myself coffee and opening my notebook at the table. Not to write anything down. Just to remind myself that when things unravel, you start by checking what still holds. I began with what I knew I controlled. I logged into my bank accounts from my laptop, the familiar screens loading slowly in the early morning light. Primary account, secondary account, automatic payments. Nothing dramatic jumped out at first. Balances were steady. Transactions looked normal. Almost too normal. That was the first warning. People who steal boldly get caught quickly. People who plan carefully take smaller steps. They change things slowly, just enough to shift control without setting off alarms. I scrolled back through the recent activity, reading every line with the same patience I used to bring to blueprints. There it was. A series of small changes. Payment dates adjusted. Mailing preferences altered. Nothing that screamed fraud. Everything that whispered intent. One account had an additional authorized contact listed. A name I recognized. One I had never approved. I closed the laptop and took a long sip of coffee. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. This wasn't shock. It was confirmation. Later that morning, after the house had emptied out, I pulled on my jacket and drove to the bank. I didn't announce where I was going. I didn't ask permission. I had learned that explaining yourself to the wrong people only teaches them how to block you next time. The branch manager recognized me immediately. He greeted me warmly, asked how I'd been offered condolences I had heard 100 times before. I returned the pleasantries and asked casually if we could review my account activity together. His expression shifted just enough to notice. We sat in a small office while he pulled up the records. I watched his eyes move across the screen, the way his brow furrowed slightly. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. "Did you authorize these changes?" he asked, finally turning the monitor toward me. "No," I said. He nodded slowly. I thought that might be the case. That sentence told me more than he realized. There had been attempts then, not successful ones, but attempts nonetheless. Requests flagged, permissions added and removed, notes attached to my profile that suggested concern, not urgency. Language designed to frame a future conversation. Concern about cognitive decline, concern about capacity, concern about protection. I thanked him for his time and asked him to place quiet holds where appropriate. Nothing drastic. Nothing that would alert anyone at home. Just enough friction to slow things down. Back in my truck, I sat for a moment with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The pieces fit together now. The dinner insult, the urgency, the paperwork, the careful avoidance. My daughter-in-law hadn't been cruel on impulse. She had been rehearsing. Her confidence that night came from believing the outcome was already secured. That realization settled something in me. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was positioning. A quiet attempt to move me out of my own life under the banner of care. When I returned home, I acted exactly as I always had. I asked about the Children's Day. I made lunch. I nodded when spoken to. No one suspected a thing. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law hovered in the doorway while I folded laundry. She watched me for a moment, then said lightly, "You've been running errands a lot lately." I smiled. "Just keeping busy." She nodded, satisfied, and walked away. I understood then how she saw me. A man easily distracted by small routines. Someone whose days blurred together. Someone unlikely to notice when larger decisions were made on his behalf. I let her keep that image. That evening, I reviewed property records from my desk after everyone had gone to bed. Everything was still intact. titles unchanged, ownership clear. But there were notes, inquiries, early steps toward valuation and review, not theft. Preparation. This wasn't about taking money and running. It was about authority, about who would be allowed to decide what happened to me, my home, my assets. About positioning themselves as caretakers before I could object. The line they were preparing to cross wasn't financial. It was personal. I closed the documents and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I thought about my wife, about how fiercely she had guarded her independence even in her final years. How she had warned me more than once that kindness without boundaries invites the wrong kind of people to lean too heavily. I had dismissed her concerns then. I wouldn't dismiss them now. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't raise alarms. I didn't pull back support abruptly. Stopping a plan too early only drives it underground. Letting it continue brings it into the light. Instead, I took one quiet step. I adjusted a single authorization. One payment, small but essential, was set to require manual confirmation. No notice sent, no explanation given. Just a pause introduced into a system that had been running smoothly for years. The effect wouldn't be immediate, but it would be felt. As I locked my desk and turned off the lamp, I felt something settle in my chest. A line had been drawn, not outwardly, but inwardly. I knew now where I stood. They were counting on my obedience, on my desire to keep the peace, on my reluctance to upset the balance of the house. They didn't understand that the balance had already been disturbed, not by my response, but by their assumption that I wouldn't notice. Impatience reveals more than confidence ever will. And once a plan depends on silence to succeed, the moment that silence breaks. Even quietly, the cracks begin to show. I went to bed, knowing that the next change wouldn't come from paperwork. It would come from behavior. I found my son in the garage late that afternoon, sitting in the driver's seat of his car with the engine off. The door was open, letting in the cool air, but he hadn't noticed. His hands were wrapped around the steering wheel as if he needed something solid to hold on to. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Something else. Folded inward. I didn't announce myself. I simply stepped into the space and leaned against the workbench. The garage smelled like oil and dust and old cardboard. A place where things were stored and forgotten. He flinched when he realized I was there. "Dad," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't hear you." "That's all right," I replied. I wasn't trying to be quiet. Silence settled between us, heavy and awkward. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as if looking at me would break something he was barely holding together. I watched him for a long moment before speaking. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to see how long he would avoid it. "You seem tired," I said finally. He let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. "Yeah, just a lot going on." I nodded. There always is. That was my opening. A gentle one. He didn't take it. He shifted in the seat, rubbed a hand over his face. "Everything okay with you?" The question felt backward. I was the one sitting outside the circle now, watching my own life being discussed in rooms I wasn't invited into, and yet here he was checking on me like I was the fragile one. "I'm fine," I said, "but I want to ask you something." His shoulders tensed. He didn't answer. When did it become normal for decisions about my life to happen without me? He swallowed. His grip tightened on the wheel. "I don't know what you mean." I studied his profile. The familiar lines of his face now etched with stress. He was my son. I had taught him how to ride a bike, how to throw a ball, how to stand up straight when things got hard. And now he couldn't even meet my eyes. "You don't have to explain," I said quietly. "Just tell me if you believe I should be kept in the dark." He turned then, finally looking at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. "No," he said quickly. "Of course not. It's just Complicated. Complicated. The word people use when they've already chosen a side and don't want to name it. Is it complicated, I asked, or is it uncomfortable? He looked away again. I recognized then what I was seeing. Not cruelty, not malice, compromise. The slow erosion of principles in the name of peace. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to survive the tension in his own house. And in doing so, he had allowed something far worse to take root. She just wants what's best, he said, almost pleading. For everyone. I felt something tighten in my chest. That's her language, I said, not yours. He flinched as if I'd struck him. She says you've been under a lot of stress, he continued, words tumbling faster now. That maybe you don't realize how much responsibility everything is. That it might be a relief to let us handle things. Handle things. The phrase echoed with meaning now. And do you believe that, I asked? He hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was enough. I think he said slowly, I think maybe it wouldn't hurt to have some support. Support? Another carefully chosen word. Soft, inoffensive, hiding the shape of something sharper beneath it. Support is offered, I replied. Control is taken. His jaw tightened. Why are you making this sound like a battle? Because it already is, I said. You're just not allowed to say that out loud. He stood abruptly, stepping out of the car and pacing a few steps away. His hands ran through his hair, fingers trembling. You don't understand, he said, voice rising. She's under pressure. We are. There are deadlines, things that need to be finalized. Deadlines. I kept my voice even. Finalized how? He stopped pacing, too abruptly. His back stiffened. I didn't mean you did, I said, and that's all right. I just need you to be honest with me now. He turned slowly, eyes wide with something close to fear. There's paperwork, he admitted. Nothing bad. Just protective. In case something happens. In case something happens to whom? To you? There it was. Spoken aloud at last. I let the words sit between us. And who decides what something looks like, I asked. He didn't answer. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I had raised him to be gentle, to avoid conflict, to believe that keeping everyone calm was the same as keeping everyone safe. Somewhere along the way, that belief had been used against him. She makes it sound so reasonable, he said quietly. Like it's already necessary. Like waiting would be irresponsible. She's rushing you, I said. Because once something like that is in place, it's very hard to undo. His eyes flicked up to mine. You think she's trying to take control? I think I replied carefully that control is already the goal. He shook his head, pacing again. You're reading too much into it. I watched him move the way he couldn't stay still, the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching. This wasn't the behavior of a man confident in his choices. This was someone trapped between loyalty and fear. Let me ask you something, I said. If I weren't here, if this were about someone else's father, would you be comfortable with how this is happening? He stopped. I don't know, he whispered. That was the answer. I felt the weight of it settle over me then. The realization that blood alone does not guarantee loyalty. That love, when mixed with dependence and manipulation, can be twisted into something unrecognizable. I won't fight you, I said finally. And I won't force you to choose. He looked at me startled. But I will protect myself, I continued. And I will not sign anything I don't fully understand. He nodded slowly, relief and fear battling across his face. There are timelines, he said, almost without meaning to. Things that need to happen soon. Soon. The word followed me as I turned to leave the garage. I stopped at the door and looked back at him. He stood there alone among the tools and boxes, looking like a man who had lost his footing and didn't know how to ask for help. I love you, I said. But love doesn't require me to disappear. He didn't respond. He couldn't. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, I thought about how betrayal rarely arrives with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrives through rationalizations, through people telling you they're doing this for your own good, through silence that feels safer than truth. I understood then that my son wasn't the architect of what was happening. He was a corridor, a way through. And that realization hurt more than the insult at the dinner table ever could. Because it meant the danger wasn't personal. It was structural. And structures once built don't collapse on their own. I had prepared for this long before I ever needed to admit it to myself. That truth settled over me as I sat alone at my desk. The house finally quiet, the weight of the last conversation still pressing against my chest. The garage scene with my son replayed in fragments, his hesitation, his borrowed language, the way he said soon like it frightened him. Soon was not an accident. Soon was a deadline. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the file. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't locked away behind false panels or buried beneath paranoia. It was exactly where it had always been, waiting for a moment I hoped would never come. The folder was thinner than most people would expect, its contents organized with a precision that came from habit rather than fear. I hadn't created it because I distrusted my family. I had created it because I understood people. When you spend a lifetime building things that must survive human error, you learn not to rely on goodwill alone. You plan for storms, even when the sky is clear. You assume that stress reveals character more than comfort ever will. After my wife's diagnosis years ago now, we had talked quietly about what might happen if one of us could no longer speak for ourselves. She had been sharp even then, practical to the end. Promise me one thing, she had said, her hand wrapped tightly around mine. Don't let anyone decide your life for you just because it's easier for them. I had promised. That promise was why the file existed. Inside were records most people never think to separate. Ownership structures that didn't sit neatly in one place. Instructions that required more than one assumption to activate. Safeguards designed not to punish, but to protect autonomy when it mattered most. The mistake my daughter-in-law had made was a common one. She had studied what was visible, the house, the accounts she knew about, the routines she believed defined my days. She had mistaken access for ownership, convenience for authority. She never asked why certain things remained untouched. She never asked why I never worried when she spoke of taking care of everything. She never asked what would happen if someone tried to take control without my consent. I read through the pages slowly, not because I needed to, but because it reminded me who I had been before I allowed myself to shrink. Each document was familiar, each clause deliberate. There was nothing emotional about it. No spite, no anger, just clarity. One section in particular held my attention longer than the rest. A provision written years earlier, triggered only under specific conditions. Not age, not illness, not inconvenience. Behavior, interference, coercion. Attempts to remove decision-making authority under the guise of protection. I hadn't built it as a weapon. I had built it as a line, and that line had now been crossed. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked softly around me the way it always had. Somewhere upstairs, my daughter-in-law turned in her sleep. Somewhere down the hall, my son shifted, restless even in rest. They had no idea how close they were to activating something they couldn't reverse. The next morning, I went about my routine as usual. Breakfast, dishes, school drop-off. I gave nothing away. My daughter-in-law watched me from across the kitchen. Her eyes sharper now, her patience thinner. She asked no questions. She didn't need to. She believed the process was already in motion. That belief was her weakness. I waited. Throughout the day, more pieces fell into place. A voicemail left half-heard. A document request forwarded without explanation. A subtle change in tone when my name came up in conversation. They were no longer hiding the plan. They were assuming it was too late to stop. That assumption confirmed everything. By evening, I no longer felt uncertain. The insult at dinner, the rush, the paperwork, the rehearsed concern, the attempt to frame me as tired, overwhelmed, in need of guidance. It all aligned, now clean and unmistakable. This wasn't about helping me. It was about bypassing me. I returned to the file after dinner, opening it one final time. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something closer to resolve. The kind that arrives when denial finally loosens its grip. I reached the page I had marked years ago and read the language carefully once more. There it was. The condition I had hoped would never be relevant, written in plain terms, impossible to misunderstand. If authority is challenged through manipulation or coercion, control reverts automatically and access is restricted without notice. No confrontation required, no permission asked. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, locking it with a soft click that echoed in the quiet room. That sound carried more finality than any raised voice ever could. I understood now that this wasn't revenge. Revenge requires emotion. This required accuracy. They had mistaken my silence for ignorance. They had mistaken my age for fragility. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. The most dangerous mistake of all was assuming the last move hadn't already been planned. I turned off the lamp and lay back on the bed, staring into the dark. My heart was steady, my breathing slow. Whatever came next would unfold quickly. Plans built on secrecy always do once the wrong person notices. Tomorrow, I would not raise my voice. I would not threaten. I would not accuse. I would simply stop holding the structure together with my own hands and allow gravity to do the rest. And when they finally realized what they had missed, it would already be too late to undo it. I didn't announce what I was about to do. I didn't argue. I didn't warn anyone. I simply let something that had always happened not happen. The morning began like every other. Coffee brewed. The children rushed through breakfast. My daughter-in-law moved through the kitchen, issuing instructions in her clipped, efficient tone. She glanced at her phone more than usual, but said nothing. Neither did I. At precisely 9 o'clock, a routine transfer that had gone out every month for years did not. No alert sounded. No siren. No dramatic moment. Just absence. People assume control disappears loudly. They imagine slammed doors and raised voices. But real power shifts are quiet. They happen inside systems that everyone takes for granted. I sat at the table sipping my coffee, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor. My hands were steady, my breathing slow. This wasn't an attack. It was a removal of support. I had chosen this move carefully. Money is a language people understand even when they pretend not to. It doesn't shout. It simply refuses to cooperate. And when it stops flowing, it exposes every structure that depended on it. Within an hour, I felt the first ripple. My daughter-in-law stood near the counterphone, pressed to her ear, her voice tight. "That doesn't make sense," she said sharply. "It's always gone through." She turned slightly away from me as she spoke, but not enough. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her free hand curled into a fist and then released. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug. She ended the call and looked at me for a moment, her expression carefully neutral. "Do you know if there's been an issue with the bank?" she asked lightly. I shook my head. "Not that I'm aware of." She studied my face, searching for something. A tell, a slip. When she found none, she nodded and walked away, heels clicking faster than usual. By midday, the house felt different. The air had changed. Conversations dropped when I entered the room, not out of secrecy now, but out of calculation. The casual dominance she had carried herself with only days earlier was gone. In its place was urgency barely contained. My son came home early that afternoon. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. His movements were restless, his eyes darting to his phone every few minutes. "Everything okay?" I asked him, folding a towel calmly. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Just work stuff. Work." Another shield, another word used to avoid truth. Later, as I prepared dinner, my daughter-in-law hovered near the doorway. She didn't cross the threshold. She didn't sit down. She lingered. "You've always handled the household expenses," she said casually. "It's a lot to keep track of. Maybe we should go over things together sometime, just to make sure everything's organized." There it was, concern disguised as collaboration. "I'm managing just fine," I replied. Her smile faltered for half a second before she recovered. "Of course," she said. "I just meant, we're a family." Family. The word felt heavier now than it had ever been. That evening, the first real consequence landed. A call came through while we were eating dinner. My daughter-in-law glanced at the screen, her face tightening, then stood abruptly and left the table. Her voice rose in the hallway, no longer controlled. "No, that can't be right." "Yes, I understand, but it's supposed to be automatic." "What do you mean it hasn't been authorized?" The children froze forks midair. My son stared at his plate. I continued eating. She returned a few minutes later, cheeks flushed, eyes sharp with panic. She sat down hard, not meeting my gaze. Dinner ended quickly after that. Later that night, my son knocked on my door. He stood in the hallway, shoulders slumped, looking older than he had the day before. "Dad," he said quietly, "did you change something?" I considered him for a moment. This wasn't confrontation. It was fear. I adjusted one thing I said. "Temporarily." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "There are bills," he said. "Things that need to be paid." "I know," I replied. He hesitated. "She's upset." I didn't answer. When he left, I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the house settle into uneasy sleep. I could feel the shift now unmistakable. The structure they had built was wobbling, and they were scrambling to hold it up. The next morning confirmed everything. My daughter-in-law was no longer subtle. She moved through the house with clipped urgency, making calls openly, now frustration bleeding into her voice. She no longer pretended not to watch me. Her eyes tracked my movements, sharp and assessing. At one point, she stopped me in the hallway. "We need to talk," she said. I looked at her calmly. "About what?" "About the finances," she replied. "About how things are being handled." Her tone was firm, but beneath it something cracked. Fear, not for me, for herself. "I'm open to conversation," I said. "When I'm ready." That unsettled her more than any refusal could have. By afternoon, the desperation had reached my son. He paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in hushed tones. I caught phrases as I passed. "No, we need more time. He hasn't agreed to anything. Yes, I know, but it's complicated." Complicated. Again. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the light shift, letting the silence do its work. I didn't need to press. Reaction was doing the work for me. That was the confirmation I needed. They hadn't planned for resistance. They had planned for obedience. They had assumed that I would continue to quietly support a system designed to remove my voice. Removing that support exposed the truth faster than any accusation ever could. That night, my daughter-in-law made one last attempt at subtlety. "You've been under a lot of stress lately," she said softly, standing in the kitchen doorway. "Maybe it would help to let us take some things off your plate. Just for a while." I met her eyes. "My plate isn't heavy," I said. "It's just no longer yours to manage." She stared at me, stunned. I went to bed that night knowing the next move wouldn't be quiet. Silence had done its job. The pressure was building now, forcing everything hidden to the surface. When money stops, truth rushes in to fill the space. And the truth they were about to reveal would change everything. The shift from tension to urgency happened overnight. By morning, the careful distance my daughter-in-law had maintained was gone. She no longer pretended everything was normal. The house felt compressed, like the walls had leaned in a few inches while no one was looking. Every movement carried purpose now. Every glance lingered a second too long. She spoke to me directly for the first time since the payment stopped. "Elias," she said, using my name with a sweetness that didn't belong there. "Can we talk for a minute?" I was at the sink rinsing a plate. I didn't turn around right away. I let the water run steady and calm before answering. "About what?" She shifted her weight, irritation flashing across her face before she masked it. "About everything. About how you've been doing. About changes." Changes. Another careful word. I dried my hands and faced her. "I'm doing fine." She smiled tightly. "We've noticed you seem overwhelmed lately." Always we. I haven't noticed that," I replied. Her jaw tightened. The politeness slipped just a fraction. "Well, sometimes people don't notice these things about themselves." There it was. The first open move. She launched into concern like it had been rehearsed. Talk of stress, of age, of how much responsibility I'd been carrying. Her tone was calm, practiced, almost professional. She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was laying groundwork. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, she folded her arms, waiting for agreement, for gratitude, for surrender. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly, "but I'm capable of managing my own affairs." Her eyes hardened. "This isn't just about you." That sentence told me everything. Later that afternoon, my son tried again. He caught me in the living room, pacing while his phone buzzed relentlessly on the table. He looked exhausted, worn down by pressure he didn't know how to name. "She's just worried," he said. "About you, about things falling behind. Things I asked." He hesitated. "Bills, paperwork, deadlines. Deadlines, always deadlines. She thinks it might help if you signed a few forms," he continued carefully. "Just to simplify things. Temporarily." There it was. Spoken aloud at last, what forms I asked. He reached for a folder on the table, slid it toward me. His hand shook. "Just routine," he said. "Protective, in case something happens." I opened the folder slowly. The language was polite, clean, legal. Words like assistance and authority woven together so tightly you wouldn't notice where one ended and the other began. I didn't need to read every page to understand the intent. This wasn't help. It was control. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I won't be signing this," I said. My son's face fell. "Dad, please. She's under a lot of stress." "And so am I," I replied. "The difference is I'm not trying to remove someone else's voice to relieve it." He looked away, ashamed. That evening, the mask slipped completely. Dinner was tense, barely eaten. The children sensed the danger and stayed quiet, eyes darting between adults. Halfway through the meal, my daughter-in-law stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We're trying to help you, and you're being difficult." The room went still. "Difficult, how?" I asked, calmly. "By refusing to cooperate," she said sharply. "By acting like this is some kind of attack." I set my fork down. "You tried to take decisions away from me without my consent," I said. "That's not help." Her voice rose. "Because you won't listen." The outburst surprised even her. She caught herself too late. "You're not thinking clearly," she continued, pushing forward now. "Anyone can see that. You're stubborn, you're tired, and you're holding everything up." My son stood. "Enough." She rounded on him. "No, this has gone on long enough." She turned back to me, eyes blazing. "If you don't sign those papers, there will be consequences." There it was. The line crossed. Like what I asked. She froze. For a split second, fear flashed across her face. Then anger rushed in to fill the gap. "You don't understand how this works," she said coldly. "People get concerned. They start asking questions. You don't want that." Concern. Questions. The implication was clear. I looked at my grandchildren. My granddaughter's hands were shaking. My grandson stared at the table, face pale. "That's enough," I said quietly. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I stood, gathered the folder, and carried it to my room. No shouting. No spectacle, just withdrawal. Behind me, I heard her voice sharp and frantic. "You're making a mistake." In my room, I closed the door and sat on the bed folder in my lap. My hands were steady as I pulled out my phone and checked the recording app I had opened earlier quietly without comment. Everything had been captured. Not because I wanted revenge, because truth matters when narratives start to form without you. Later that night, she came to my door. She knocked once hard. "I know you're awake," she said through the door. I didn't answer. "We can do this the easy way," she continued, "or the hard way." I smiled to myself. When I finally opened the door, she looked startled. She hadn't expected calm. "You're overplaying your hand," I said gently. "And you don't even realize it." Her face twisted. "You think you're in control?" "You stopped one payment. That doesn't give you power." "No," I agreed. "Your reaction does?" She stared at me, breath-shallow eyes darting. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked cornered. I closed the door softly in her face. That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, I sat at my desk and listened to the recording once more. Her words were clear, her intent unmistakable. The insult at dinner had been cruelty. This was danger. I understood then that there would be no returning to how things were. No gentle resolution, no misunderstanding to clear up. When someone tries to take your voice, they tell you exactly who they are if you listen long enough. And I had listened. Whatever came next would force her into the open, where manipulation loses its power and fear takes its place. The mask was off. Now it was only a matter of time before everything else followed. The collapse didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in layers, each one peeling away the confidence my daughter-in-law had worn like armor. By morning, the house no longer pretended to be calm. Phones rang openly now. Conversations weren't lowered when I entered the room. There was no point in secrecy anymore. The plan had hit resistance, and resistance was not something she had prepared for. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the day unfold, as if from a distance. The sunlight felt sharper than usual. Sounds carried farther. Every movement in the house felt exaggerated, like actors who had forgotten their lines and were improvising badly. The first call came before 9. I didn't hear the voice on the other end, but I heard her side of it clearly enough. "No, that can't be right." "Yes, I understand what you're saying." "No, he didn't authorize that." Her voice rose with each sentence, control slipping as frustration took its place. She paced the length of the kitchen, heels striking the floor harder than necessary, eyes flicking toward me again and again as if daring me to react. I didn't. The second call came less than an hour later. This time she didn't bother leaving the room. "You said this was already handled," she snapped into the phone. "You said it wouldn't be an issue." She stopped pacing and stood still listening. Her face drained of color. "What do you mean it's frozen?" she demanded. "That doesn't make any sense." She ended the call abruptly and stood there breathing hard, hands trembling at her sides. For a moment she looked genuinely lost. Not angry, not calculating, afraid. My son appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. "What's going on?" he asked. She rounded on him. "What's going on is that everything is falling apart." She turned back to me, then eyes blazing. "This is because of you." I met her gaze calmly. "Because of your assumptions," I replied. That sent her over the edge. "You think you can just pull the rug out from under us?" she shouted. "Do you have any idea what's at stake?" "I do," I said. "That's why I'm sitting down." Her laugh was sharp, almost hysterical. "You're enjoying this?" I shook my head. "No. I'm observing it." The words seemed to confuse her. She stared at me as if trying to decide whether I was mocking her or threatening her. The house descended into chaos over the next few hours. My son was on the phone constantly now, voice tight, apologetic. I heard him say the same phrases over and over. "We just need more time. No, he hasn't agreed. I don't know what to tell you. Time, always time, the thing they were running out of. By midday, desperation had replaced strategy entirely. She cornered me in the hallway, blocking my path with her body. There was no performance left in her now, no polite concern, just raw fear sharpened into anger. "You need to fix this," she said. "Now." I looked at her steadily. "Fix what?" "You know exactly what," she snapped. "The payments, the accounts, all of it." "Those were never yours," I replied. Her face twisted. "Everything in this house depends on that money." There it was, spoken plainly at last. "And yet," I said softly, "you called me useless." The words hit her harder than I expected. For a split second, her bravado shattered. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The first crack had become a fracture. That afternoon, the consequences arrived in waves. Notices, missed obligations, escalations she hadn't planned for. I didn't need to see the details to understand the pattern. A system built on uninterrupted obedience does not survive disruption. The real break came just before dinner. We were all in the living room when the call came. She answered it on speaker without realizing, her hands shaking too badly to be careful. "No, please," she said, her voice suddenly thin. "We just need a little more time." There was a pause. Whoever was on the other end spoke for a long moment. Her knees buckled. She sank down onto the edge of the couch, one hand gripping the armrest, the other pressed to her mouth, as if to hold something in. The room was silent, except for the voice on the phone, calm and distant, outlining consequences she could no longer avoid. When the call ended, she stayed there, staring at nothing. My son looked at her, then at me, his face pale. "Dad," he whispered. "What did you do?" "I stopped pretending," I said. That was when she broke. She slid off the couch and onto her knees in front of me, the sound of it echoing through the room. It was so sudden, so complete that even the children gasped. "I'll do anything," she said, voice cracking. "Anything, just make it stop." The woman who had called me a servant was now begging at my feet. I didn't move. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was a deep, unsettling clarity. This was not repentance. This was fear stripped bare. "Please," she sobbed. "We didn't mean for it to go this far." I looked at my son. He stood, frozen hands clenched, eyes wide with disbelief. Whatever illusions he had been holding on to were gone now. There was no misinterpreting this moment. "I never wanted this," he said weakly. "That may be true," I replied. "But you allowed it." She reached for my leg, fingers trembling. I gently stepped back out of her reach. "Stand up," I said. She hesitated, then obeyed, pulling herself to her feet with difficulty. Her face was streaked with tears, mascara smudged, composure completely destroyed. "I'm not going to fix anything today," I continued calmly. "Not because I can't, because this isn't how accountability works." Her breathing hitched. "Then what do you want?" I held her gaze. Truth, transparency, and time to decide what comes next. My son opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. For the first time, he looked at me not as a passive presence in the house, but as the authority he had forgotten I was. "I'll agree to pause what's happening," I said. "For now. But understand this clearly. Nothing goes back to the way it was." She nodded frantically. "Yes. Yes, whatever you want." I felt no urge to comfort her. No need to soften the moment. Begging is not remorse. It is panic. And panic makes promises it cannot keep. That night the house was silent in a way it had never been before. No whispered calls, no pacing, no schemes unfolding behind closed doors, just the hollow quiet that follows collapse. As I sat alone in my room, I thought about the dinner table, about the insult that had started all of this, about how quickly certainty turns to desperation when built on the wrong foundation. She had believed power came from control. She was wrong. Power comes from knowing when to stop holding everything together. And tomorrow, I would decide what justice actually looked like. The house was quiet the next morning, but it wasn't the kind of silence that pretends nothing happened. It was heavier, settled, like dust after a collapse. I woke early and sat at the kitchen table alone, the same table where I had been mocked, threatened, and finally watched the truth spill out in full view of everyone. The chair across from me was empty. No one rushed in with a phone pressed to their ear. No whispered calls, no clipped instructions. For the first time since my family moved in, the house felt like it was waiting for me. That was the real shift. Power doesn't announce itself with noise. It announces itself when everyone else waits to see what you'll do next. They gathered in the living room mid-morning. My son, his wife. The children stayed upstairs. That was deliberate, and I appreciated it. Some lessons don't need witnesses that young. My daughter-in-law sat rigid on the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes red and swollen. She looked smaller now. Not physically, structurally. The confidence that once carried her had collapsed inward, leaving nothing but fear and calculation. My son stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. He hadn't slept. Neither had I. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pace. I didn't accuse. I sat. This isn't about punishment, I said calmly. It's about boundaries. My daughter-in-law flinched at the word. For a long time, I continued this house operated on assumptions. You assumed I would stay quiet. You assumed I would keep paying. You assumed that concern could be used as leverage. I paused, letting the words settle. Those assumptions are over. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Whatever she had planned to say no longer fit the moment. These are the terms, I said. Not as revenge, as structure. I outlined them carefully. Slowly. No room for confusion. Financial access would be restructured immediately. No shared authority, no automatic permissions. Nothing would move without my knowledge and consent. All legal matters involving my name, health, property, or finances would require full transparency. No intermediaries, no handling things for me. Any future conversations about my capacity would happen with me present. Period. If those conditions weren't met, support would not resume. The room felt smaller as I spoke. Not because I was threatening them, but because reality had finally arrived. My daughter-in-law stared at the floor, breathing shallowly. My son rubbed his face with both hands. "This isn't fair," he said quietly. I turned to him. "Fair compared to what?" He looked up at me, eyes tired and conflicted. We were trying to keep everything together. And in doing so, I replied, "You decided I was the problem to manage." The words landed hard. "I raised you to think," I continued, "not to hand your judgment to someone else, because it's easier. Loyalty does not mean silence. Love does not mean erasing your father." He nodded slowly, the truth sinking in like weight he could no longer ignore. I turned back to his wife. "This is where things change," I said. "Not because you're sorry, but because you're no longer in control." She finally looked up at me then. Her eyes were wet but sharp. She understood exactly what I meant. "This is permanent," she said softly. "Not a question." "Yes," I replied. "It is." That was the moment she truly understood. Not when she knelt, not when she begged, but now when she realized there would be no reset, no pretending this had all been a misunderstanding. Consequences aren't dramatic. They're quiet, and they last. We talked for another hour, not emotionally, practically. Living arrangements, responsibilities, expectations. Everything that had been left vague before was now defined. I wasn't cruel. I didn't insult her. I didn't throw her words back in her face. I didn't need to. By the time we finished, the roles in the room had shifted completely. Not through domination, but through clarity. Afterward, my son stayed behind while his wife went upstairs. He sat across from me, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he used to when he was a boy who disappointed me. "I didn't see it," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "That doesn't excuse it," he said. "No," I agreed. "But it explains it." He looked up at me then. "Are you going to leave?" The question surprised me. "No," I said. "I'm not running from my life. I'm reclaiming it." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "You don't," I said. "You live differently going forward. That's the fix." That afternoon, the house began to adjust. Conversation slowed. People asked instead of assumed. Doors stayed open. For the first time in a long while, no one watched me to see what I'd tolerate. They watched to see what I'd decide. I spent the evening alone in my room, not out of isolation, but out of choice. I thought about how close I had come to losing more than money. How easily the narrative could have turned against me if I hadn't paid attention. This wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to disappear. Justice doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like structure returning to where it was quietly removed. Late that night, my daughter-in-law knocked on my door. She stood there stiffly, hands clasped in front of her eyes, guarded. "I understand now," she said, "that this isn't temporary." "Yes," I replied. "I'll follow the rules," she said. I studied her for a moment. "Rules are easy," I said. "Behavior is harder." She nodded. No argument this time. When I closed the door, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, resolution. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stopped them from destroying me. Consequences don't need anger to be effective. They just need consistency. And for the first time in a very long time, my life was my own again. Peace doesn't arrive the way people imagine it will. It doesn't come with relief or celebration or the sense that everything has been neatly resolved. It arrives quietly, like a room that finally stops echoing after someone leaves. At first, the silence feels strange, almost uncomfortable. Then you realize it isn't empty. It's stable. That was the feeling in the house in the days that followed. No one rushed me anymore. No one spoke over me or around me. Conversation slowed down. Questions replaced assumptions. I noticed small changes first. A pause before a request. A knock before entering my room. Eyes that checked my expression instead of ignoring it. Respect doesn't announce itself. It shows up in behavior. I won't pretend everything was suddenly warm. It wasn't. Trust doesn't regenerate overnight. Some things once broken never return to their original shape. But they don't have to. They only need to stop causing harm. I sat one afternoon in the backyard, watching the children play, and realized how close I had come to losing more than money or authority. I had nearly lost my voice, my place, the example I was setting for them. They were watching all along. I thought about the man I had become after my wife died. How grief had taught me to shrink my presence instead of reclaim it. How I mistook silence for dignity and endurance for virtue. How I believed that staying agreeable would keep me safe. What it actually did was make me convenient. Age has a way of stripping away illusions. People start to assume you are tired, that you're behind, that you should step aside gracefully and let others decide what's best for you. I had believed some of that myself. But age also brings clarity if you let it. I may not move as fast as I once did. My hands may ache in the morning. My reflection may surprise me when I catch it in the mirror. But none of that touched my judgment. None of it erased my right to decide my own life. That was the lesson I learned too late and just in time. My son and I speak differently now. There is more honesty between us and more distance where it's needed. He no longer mistakes silence for agreement. I no longer protect him from discomfort at the cost of my own dignity. Our relationship didn't end. It matured painfully into something truer. As for my daughter-in-law, the boundaries are clear. She follows them. Not because she suddenly understands respect in her bones, but because she understands consequence. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it has to be. I don't hate her. Hate requires energy I no longer waste on people who have shown me who they are. What I feel instead is resolve. A calm certainty about what I will and will not tolerate. Revenge isn't what most people think it is. It isn't humiliation. It isn't cruelty. It isn't watching someone fall apart and feeling satisfaction at their pain. True revenge is quiet. It's the restoration of truth. The moment when the story stops being told about you and starts being told by you. The tables didn't turn because I shouted. They turned because I stopped holding everything up by myself. That night at the dinner table when she called me a servant, she believed I had no power left. What she didn't understand was that the most dangerous people are the ones who no longer need to prove anything. I'm 70 years old now. I don't need approval, I don't need permission, and I don't need to disappear so others can feel important. The most dangerous moment in life isn't when you lose strength. It's when you believe you're too old to change anything. That belief is a lie that benefits everyone except you. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after hearing my story, it's this: kindness without boundaries is not virtue. It's vulnerability. And vulnerability, when mistaken for weakness, invites the wrong kind of people to test how far they can go. If you've ever been talked over in your own home, underestimated by your own family, or made to feel like your value expired with age, you're not alone. And you're not powerless. I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever been treated as invisible by the people closest to you? What would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have stayed silent longer or drawn the line sooner? Share your thoughts in the comments. These stories don't end when the video does. They continue in the conversations we have together. If you're finding meaning in stories like this, stay with the channel. There are more truths to uncover, more quiet victories to tell, and more reminders that dignity doesn't fade with time. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. Not for me, for the stories that deserve to be heard, especially by those who were told it was too late to speak. Thank you for listening.